a problem. Politicians are saying we want to do something to deal with it, so they're throwing lots of money. So the Inflation Reduction Act just on climate is proposing to spend $369 billion. Now, this will actually reduce carbon emissions from the US. The point that I made was, well, why are they only talking about emissions? I'm not affected by emissions. I'm affected by temperature and sea level rise.
Welcome to Redacted Conversations. This is the show where we invite journalists, thought leaders, and whistleblowers on to talk about the biggest stories of our day. And perhaps one of the biggest stories of all time, perhaps one of the biggest lies, is that we are in a climate crisis and that we only have a few more years on this planet before the rest of the planet is destroyed.
Our guest today is author and researcher and social scientist Bjorn Lomborg. He's the author of the book False Alarm: How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet, a real thought leader around how we should think and behave around climate change. This book really changed my worldview. I will admit, sort of a climate snob, and I felt comfortable telling people to change their lives and their habits until this book. And so I want to ask, I'm so glad to talk to you. I'm thrilled to meet you. Thank you for joining us. Can you first sort of respond to this message and how it's really riling people up emotionally?
So, look, and thanks a lot for being on the show. So my sense on this is really, yes, there is no climate emergency. There's a real problem with climate, but the way that we're being told this is the end of the world, and you know, look, we do that with a lot of things. News has a tendency to just focus on bad stories, but there's also a preponderance of focus on things that could potentially be really scary, and then later on, oh, we found out it wasn't. And it often neglects that we are very, very good at adapting and very good at dealing with problems. And so we're being scared witless for very little reason. Let me just give you one, I think, kind of scary statistic. So the OECD did a new survey of all the OECD and also some non-OECD countries. So basically the rich world. And what they found was, on average, in the rich world, 60% of all people believe that global warming will likely lead to the end of mankind. That's just astounding. And remember, if you actually read the UN climate panel reports, which I don't recommend, they're very long and somewhat boring. But if you read them, there is no mention of this. There is no indication that this is the case. Now, global warming is a problem, yes, but it's by no means challenging the end of the world. And this, of course, both leads to scaring our kids witless. You know, that's why we have people like Greta Thunberg. If I was a teenager and watched the news night after night telling us this terrible thing happened, and it's all because of global warming, I understand why you'd get really scared. Yes. That's both wrong, and it also leads to bad decisions because we're scared witless, we make bad and panicky decisions, and of course, it means that our kids, say, why should I bother going to school? Right. I understand that, but it's terrible because it's wrong. So yes, absolutely, there's no climate emergency. There's a problem, and we're not fixing it well because we're scared and we do bad policy.
And you have a new piece in the Wall Street Journal this morning. If people are dialing into the Wall Street Journal, an opinion piece, and you write the Inflation Reduction Act does little to reduce climate change. Of course, this has been much discussed over the past week. President Biden signing the Inflation Reduction Act into law. And Democrats are saying this is the biggest move to reduce our climate emergency ever in the history of the world. You say it does nothing, almost little, to reduce climate change. Why? I guess this is where it all comes from, right? It's the politicians pushing this narrative. If the UN climate panel is saying there is no emergency, then it's all fabricated.
Well, I think it's slightly different than that. So fundamentally, there is a problem. politicians are saying we want to do something to deal with it. So they're throwing lots of money. So the Inflation Reduction Act just on climate is proposing to spend $369 billion. Now, this will actually reduce carbon emissions from the US. The point that I made was, well, why are they only talking about emissions? I'm not affected by emissions. I'm affected by temperature and sea level rise. And so if you actually go and look at how much will this affect temperature, well, plug it into the UN climate model. It's readily available. I did that. If you plug in what we expect will be reduced from the US emissions over the next decade and possibly even over the next 80 years, how much will that actually change temperature? And the answer is very, very little, depending on whether you're in Celsius and Fahrenheit. So I'm just going to give you both. In Celsius, it's a half a 1,000th of 1 degree temperature reduction by the end of the century. In Fahrenheit, it's almost 1,000th of a degree Fahrenheit. That's just nothing. And even if you sort of very generously assume that after all the money is run out with the Inflation Reduction Act, we will still be cutting enormous amounts of CO2. It will reduce temperatures by less than 1.5/100th of a degree in Celsius and about 3/100ths in Fahrenheit. This is simply because we talk about stuff that sounds impressive rather than talk about what will actually happen. And the reason why so little will happen is because cutting, about 8% is what they're talking about, 8 percentage points from the US is just not what's going to change the world. First of all, the US is much, much larger than the 8%. The US is only one part of the rich world, and even the rich world is only a small part of most of the emissions that are going to come from China, India, the rest of Asia, and Africa. We have no sense of how rich, well-meaning people will cut carbon emissions and do a little good, but that most of this is about getting India, China, and Africa to cut. And we're not there when we're telling, look, all it takes is spend $369 billion and you'll cut it a little bit. They're not going to say, ooh, that sounds great. I want to do that too.
Right.
Look, they have other and more important priorities like getting their populations out of poverty and get them food and get them education. So not surprisingly, we're only going to fix climate when we make green energy so cheap everyone will want it. Remember what the US did. So the US basically took fracking from something that was an idea in one guy's mind in the early 2000s. 10 years later, for about $10 billion in subsidies, they produced a technology that basically enabled lots more gas to be mined. That meant that gas became cheaper than coal. That meant that the US reduced its carbon emissions more than any other nation in the world over the last 15 years. And crucially, it makes the US about $150 billion in more GDP every year. That's a huge win. You have cheaper energy, you have less pollution from climate change, and you get richer. How is that not a win? That is what we should try to get everyone else to do. So Europe, obviously, with the war in Ukraine, but also China and India. If we could get them fracking over the next 10, 20 years, we could cut carbon emissions much more, and it would be cheaper for them, and it would be better. So this is a technology issue much more than it is a moral issue. And we would be much smarter about it if we stopped being so scared.
But fracking has such a bad reputation. We have celebrities such as the Incredible Hulk. He's very anti-fracking.
Yeah, Mark Ruffalo.
Mark Ruffalo, right? Talking about how it harms people. And so people who are well-intentioned, who don't understand the technology, then think, well, no, this is actually harming people. And so what we need to do is take away the cheapest energy, which you point out harms poor people first, right?
Yes. So there's two things to this. Look, any energy technology has downsides. So remember, coal pollutes a lot. It probably kills more than 500,000 people every year. It's not like our existing energy technologies are great. Solar panels have people falling down when you install them on your roof. Nothing is safe in that way. And yes, fracking has problems, much, much less than what was highlighted when people first were talking about it. And we have good regulation for most of this. So if you look at the total cost and benefits, so the biggest study done in the US, I think it's a couple of years old now, showed that the net benefit, as I talked about, was about $150 billion because you just get much richer. But there is a cost to fracking, mostly in increased air pollution. It's not really the drinking water, but there's more air pollution in local areas, which is probably costing about $25 billion. So there are costs, and the people who get those costs should be in some way reimbursed. Now, they are in the US because you own the land where you frack. And that's why most people are actually willing to say, all right, it's going to be a little more air pollution here in my neighborhood, but I'm also going to get fabulously rich. Okay.
Right.
So you make that decision, but we haven't in Europe because you don't own the underground. So what you basically have is a situation where someone will come in and frack, they'll make a lot of money, but you'll just be left with the air pollution. I get why most people don't want that. And so we have a systemic problem, which you could rectify through legislation. This is not a wicked problem. We have $150 billion in benefits, $25 billion in disbenefits. We should be able to figure that out. But we're not. And yes, Mark Ruffalo is not helping when he's just showing us samples of bad water and that kind of stuff. That's just silly.
But we're told that climate change disproportionately hurts the poor. So we must take away resources from the poor, right? In order to help them. When your point is that our solutions hurt the poor.
Yeah, they get screwed over and over again.
And it's true that climate change will hurt the world's poor the most because they typically live where it's already pretty damn hot, and they will be harmed more with climate. That's often, as you say, used as an argument to say, so we should help them by cutting carbon emissions. But remember, poor people everywhere are hurt worst by pretty much everything.
Yes.
It's not like poor people are well off in all kinds of other ways. That's why they're poor. So they're hit worse with bad education, with health, with nutrition, with any other issue. And so in reality, there is something almost pathological in the way that we seem to say, look, the world's poor, whose kids are dying from easily curable infectious diseases and not enough food and bad education, all kinds of other things. I think it's really sad for them. So you know what? I'm going to help them by not driving my car tomorrow. What? Right. At very best, it'll make them slightly less worse off in 100 years instead of actually helping them right now. There are so many things we could do to help them right now. And of course, crucially, if you want to help poor people getting better able to tackle global warming, you should think about adaptation. Remember, a hurricane that hits Florida, yeah, it makes a lot of destruction, but and typically kill a few people, and that's it. But the same hurricane hitting, for instance, Guatemala will be wiping out their economy and killing tens of thousands of people. So the point here is, if you're poor, you're really badly hurt. Should we help them by making future hurricanes slightly less stronger? Or should we help them by getting rich so they are not living in corrugated roof and don't know how to deal with these issues, but are well-worn and live in mason houses and better infrastructure and are much more resilient? Of course, it's the latter. It's both better for climate, but it's also better for all kinds of other things.
Do you see a movement happening here? I mean, again, we talked about off the top here, these 1,100 scientists, and not just, we have Nobel Prize winning scientists who are on this list who are saying enough is enough. This outrage and the political response to this problem is out of alignment with the actual problem. And I was surprised you sort of set out in the beginning of the book to talk about global warming is real. But the way that the politicians, of course, are framing it is not, and it's unreasonable to think that the world is going to end in. So we only have I guess according to them, we only have like 12 years left, and then we're done. We're totally done, right? We have to hit these climate targets. We've heard John Kerry talk about this as he flies around in his jet, that we only have 12 years left. So I was surprised by that you talk about global warming is real. I didn't think that you would go there. So talk about that aspect of it. How is global warming real? What should we be concerned about? And maybe what are some of the policies we could put in place to actually fix that problem?
Yes. So I'm a social scientist, so I'm mostly focused on the cost and benefits of our different solutions. So I simply take what a lot, and literally thousands of climate scientists and other scientists are telling us, yes, global warming is real. Fundamentally, if you put more CO2 into the atmosphere, which typically comes from burning fossil fuels, you will create an extra slight blanket around the world that will simply insulate us a little more. Now, this has been incredibly good. If we didn't have this, the world would be freezing cold. So we should be happy about this, but we're adding a little more, and that will be a problem. For this very, very simple reason, that all of our societies are built to what our historical temperature was, or historical situations from all kinds of weather. So, imagine Miami and imagine Boston. Miami, semi-tropical weather, Boston, freezing cold in the winter,
Yes.
right? Or, here in Europe,
Correct.
it'd be sort of Athens and Helsinki. Both cities are pretty well adjusted to their current conditions. If you made those conditions different, either if it became warmer or if it became colder, both would have to spend money on adapting. That's really the basic point. If you change the world's climate, it's not like there's an optimal climate out there and we're somehow magically there 100 years ago and now we're screwing it up. It's more that we have adapted our world to what it used to be. If that temperature and other things change, that will be costly no matter what we do. It's not going to be phenomenally costly, but it will be costly. So remember, for instance, as temperatures rise, you're going to see more heat waves, and you're also going to see fewer cold waves. This matters because many, many more people die from cold than from heat. So actually, over the last 20 years, we've seen fewer people die in total, contrary to what you hear in the news. But it's still a problem that more people will die from heat. But there's a very simple solution. That was what you asked me. What are the solutions? Air conditioning. It's not rocket science.
Right.
We know that we should get people, especially old and vulnerable people, into places that are air conditioned. So in the US, you either make sure that you can afford an air conditioner by having cheap electricity, or you open up the malls, or you make sure that the assisted living homes for elderly are air conditioned. This is not rocket science. So
no, it's funny you say that. I just finished reading Laura Hildebrand's book, Unbroken, which about Louis Zamperini. And he comes to New York City in 1936, where there's a heat wave. He's training for the Olympics. And it was the massive heat wave, and it was one of the highest temperatures ever recorded. 3,000 people died in New York City because there was no air conditioning. People were buying movie tickets just to go into cold movies just to sleep. And yeah, like there are little things we can do, like maybe subsidizing, the government could step up and provide air conditioning in areas where poor people don't have it or don't have access to it.
Yes,
right?
but you point out research that says for every heat death, there are 17 people who die from cold in your book, which I found really fascinating because that's not what the media would have us believe. In fact, we're told winters are more mild. It's a big tragedy because people can't ski any longer for long ski seasons. This is a big one, right? We're going to start to see this again, especially around the Olympics. There's no snow for ski resorts. This is a tragedy. But we're also told that more people will die from heat. So you cannot have it both ways.
No, and look, this is the way that the media constantly focuses on the negative. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. We want to fix problems. So we should hear about the bad things, but we should also keep in mind that there are a lot of positive things. And as you point out, so the study that I mentioned in the book is from 2015. That was mostly based on the data that we had back then, which is mostly from rich countries. There's an update in 2022 that now looks at all countries in the world. Most of this is studies because we don't have good data, for instance, for middle of Africa and that kind of place. But fundamentally, it shows that everywhere, almost everywhere, there are many more cold deaths and heat deaths, even in very hot Africa. And this is fundamentally because we're a tropical species. Turns out that there's about 500,000 people that die every year from heat, but 4.5 million, or 9 times bigger, 4.5 million people die from cold.
Wow.
We're not well informed if you only hear the first part. So, oh my God, more people are dying from heat, but many fewer people are dying from cold. We should know this. And the funny thing, you talked about the story from New York. So we have good numbers for the US that you've seen a dramatic decline in the number of people dying from heat because we've gotten air conditioning in the US. In Europe, for instance, many other places in the world, especially in India only about 4% have air conditioning, mainly because they're poor. They want much, much more air conditioning, not because of dealing with global warming. That's a very fractional thing, but because it's already terrible now, and they want to have more air conditioning. But the crucial thing is, so we've seen a dramatic decline in heat deaths in the U.S. and other places when you get air conditioning. But cold deaths are actually going up, despite the fact that we're seeing, global warming, should all other things equal, make cold deaths go down. Why? Because heating is becoming much more expensive, partly because of our climate policies. So the fundamental thing that we forget is that if you make energy cheap, you can not only afford to keep your air conditioner running in the summer and avoid heat death, but you can also keep your heat on in the winter. And that's crucial, especially for older people, especially for poor people. So what happened when we got fracking, there's a big study of that, showed that when you got cheaper gas, so the people who heat their homes with gas, which is not the majority of people in the US, that actually reduced the amount of heat deaths by about 11,000 people. So cheaper gas meant 11,000 people every year don't die from cold deaths. And of course, now that we're getting higher prices, we'll see more people die.
Yeah, I mean, what we just covered on the show yesterday, then all of the wood prices up about 30% for certain types of beech wood right now. Denmark is trying to produce as many wood stoves as they possibly can right now, and they're back ordered through March. They can't get them to people quickly enough because of these regulations, Russian sanctions. So these climate policies, and then also turning off nuclear power in Germany. It seems to me a lot of this is man-made.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And remember, not all of it is because of climate regulation, but absolutely the fundamental idea of climate policy has been we want to get rid of fossil fuels, and then we'll just have lots and lots of renewables. This sounds really good, and especially when a lot of people tell you, you know what, solar and wind is cheaper than fossil fuels. But the problem that they forget to tell you is that's only true when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. When the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing, it's infinite cost of solar and wind power. You can't buy it. And that's, of course, why we still need lots of gas. That's why we have the problem in Europe right now, that gas prices are going through the roof. You can't make a world work just with solar and wind. You need something that's actually baseload power, something that runs 24/7. Now, people would tell you, oh, but that's going to be batteries. But the reality is batteries are nowhere near being able to store all the power that we need.
No.
Remember, right now, the world has enough batteries to keep its current power, so the average power that we use per hour, for about a minute and 15 seconds.
Whoa.
So we have enough. Actually, they can't process this through. So it's more like very, very small fraction would get like 3 hours of power. But the reality is we can't keep the world on with batteries right now. And we're not going to be able to in any foreseeable future. So the trick here is to recognize the current solutions are only at very best part solutions. So, some solar, some wind will undoubtedly need nuclear, will undoubtedly need to be able to carbon capture. And all of this will have to be so cheap that everyone will want it. Not just rich, well-meaning Americans and Europeans, but also China, India, and Africa.
Now, one of the major points you make in the book is that if you want to help poor people, you have to root for them to increase GDP in their own country. Because when you do that, then people stop, say, cooking on gas stoves indoors and stop dying from that, right? They are able to invest in cleaner technology only. So for instance, I had this friend who said she wanted to take a vacation to Egypt, but she doesn't want to go there because it never rains and she'll feel guilty for taking a shower, right? And so this is how these beliefs weigh on us. We think that we are parasites, right? And so I said, well, if you read this book, it might make you think that actually going to Egypt would help their GDP, and they may actually be able to innovate in order to adapt better. So not going to Egypt might not be the most compassionate thing to do, right? And so this is how we sort of mess with ourselves, that humans are parasites, everything we do is wrong, and that anyone who is, say, using a single-use plastic item is a selfish jerk, right? And so can you talk more about the effect of helping GDP? You can see I've thought about this a lot. Like, it's really a part of who I am, and I don't know how to behave.
She's been losing sleep over it. She's been losing sleep over this, Bjorn. I'm going to tell you, we have like these little reusable bags in our house. We have like beeswax wrappers instead of plastic. Like, so she's going down the rabbit hole on this.
Yeah.
and so let me just take this sort of the small things that we're talking about. There's a wonderful guy who's the advisor to the UK climate ministry, David McKay, and he used to say, if we all do little things, it'll add up to a little. And that's important to recognize. This is not about us doing small bits and pieces. This is about making grand changes in how we produce energy, for instance. That's why I was talking about, if we could innovate, say, fourth generation nuclear to be cheaper than fossil fuels, we're nowhere near that right now. But if we could, everyone would switch and we'd be done. It's not really rocket science. Again, this is about the big technological breakthroughs. Instead, people very often make it about this little plastic thing, or we should do this, that, and the other. Remember, why is there a lot of plastic in the ocean? People think it's because you use plastic straws. No, it's not. It's for two things. Most of it in mass, like 75% of it, is fishing equipment. Now, you might want to do something about that, but that's a totally different thing than your plastic straws. Most of the rest of the plastic comes there because Europe and other nations decided they were going to recycle because it feels good. But remember, it's very expensive. So what we did was we basically sold a lot of it to China and later on to Vietnam and the Philippines and many other places. When you send over a whole barge of all this plastic waste, the guys who buy this either have to spend lots of money on actually processing this, or they could accidentally lose it in the ocean, which, not surprisingly, a lot of them did. So most of the plastic waste comes from us wanting to feel good, but not be willing to pay enough to do it. It's not that your plastic straws in well-organized societies go into the ocean. I mean, that's really, really hard to do. It goes to a landfill, or more likely it gets incinerated and actually used for energy recovery. That's what advanced societies do. It doesn't happen in the Philippines or in Vietnam, but that's because they're poor. And then we're back to that whole point of saying, well, maybe we should help them be less poor. And that goes to your point on GDP. So a lot of people think GDP can't be right. It's just money. It's just something the economists will talk about. But remember, GDP correlates very well. Actually, it turns out to be one of the best correlators are pretty much all things that we like. You live longer, you're better educated, your kids die less, you have more opportunities, you're better, healthcare, you're bigger apartments, you have everything pretty much is better. And this, of course, is for the very simple reason that if you're better off, you can afford to deal with many more problems. If you're poor, and I think most of the people that we're going to be talking to, and most, your friend who didn't want to travel to Egypt, have no sense of what most people in Egypt and much, much poorer places actually have to suffer through. If you're really poor, you're so screwed in so many ways. And so again, I'm reminded by the way that we want to help these people by doing something that has virtually no impact in their lives, only in 100 years.
Yeah.
Remember, by the end of the century, we estimate that people will be much, much better off. This is the UN's own statistic. So right now, on average, and this is a very funny thing because that's our average of really rich people like Bill Gates and some really poor people in Africa. But on average, the world income is about $10,000 per person per year. By the end of the century, we'll be 450% as rich as that. Each and every one of us. That means pretty much everyone will be lifted out of poverty. And we have a hard time imagining that. But remember what the world was like in 1900. Most of us were very poor. Even rich people were what we would consider very poor. Only a few people could travel around the world. Now everyone can. The point here is to recognize that we will be much, much better off. And that's one of the points I try to make in my book. Global warming will overall be a net problem That's why it's something that we should be concerned about. And the best indicator, so the only climate economist to win the Nobel Prize in climate economics is William Nordhaus out of Yale University. His estimate and many others seem to indicate that if we did nothing about climate change, it would be equivalent to reducing our incomes by about 4%. That's not a trivial amount. That's certainly something we should be aware of. It's not, as we started out talking about, the end of the world. It's 2%. But remember, because we're going to be 450% as rich as we are today, that basically means if we did nothing about climate change, it would feel like we were only 434% as rich by the end of the century. That's not the end of the world. No. That's a world that's much, much better, but slightly less better than it otherwise could have been. So let's work to deal with it, but let's not get crazy about it.
I mean, that speaks to the hypocrisy, right? I mean, we're literally
I'm already crazy about it. Like, I'm many years into the crazy. So I am like finding it hard to know how to behave in the world because I, bought into this sort of, it makes you very judgmental. Like when you see someone using something that's like a plastic water bottle, it's like, you must not care like I do, right?
Right. You must hate the dolphins.
Right.
And look, there's nothing wrong with wanting to do good. And we should applaud people for wanting to do good, but then do real good. Yeah. And first of all, this is not mostly about us changing our water bottles or something like that. And again, if you live in a well-organized society, there's none of this garbage that'll actually make it out into the sea. It's simply an indication that you decided to spend some of your money on a water bottle rather than, I don't know, travel to Mallorca, which also has environmental consequences. One of the fun things, I'm actually a vegetarian, but I love the way that a lot of people will say, oh, it's the way to save the world. It'll reduce carbon emissions by 50%. Well, maybe it'll reduce your food emissions by 50%, but those food emissions are a fairly small part of your total emissions. Yeah. So it'll reduce your emissions about 4%. But remember, because being vegetarian is cheaper, you have more money left over to do other stuff, and you will use that. So the actual reduction turns out to only be about 2%. Now, again, if you want to do this, great, but don't believe that this is what's going to save the world. We're not going to save the world by us, not using a water bottle or anything. We're going to save the world by making innovations like fracking, and of course, we need to go further in that, so that everyone can embrace eventually a carbon-free lifestyle that will be cheaper and better than the one that we have today.
If you listen to the Biden administration, though, over the past few days as they passed this Inflation Reduction Act, and you write about this in your Wall Street Journal opinion piece about the costs of green energy. So Jennifer Granholm, who's the energy secretary this weekend, said, well, if you're poor, the way to combat that right now is to winterize your home, and get solar panels on your home. We did the math on that. Of course, it's like $17,000, but they'll give you a 30% tax rebate. So if you're poor, just put solar panels on your house, and that will solve the problem. It seems like I'm in a crazy world. Like when I hear something like that.
Yeah. I mean, that was also spectacularly insensitive, right? That's a little bit like let them eat cake kind of thing. And I find that when you look at electric vehicles, people who drive them, if you've ever driven a Tesla, they're really, really nice cars, but they also cost $100,000. So it's easy for people who live in homes where you can actually have the plug. Remember, most people don't live in a nice suburban single apartments. They live in high rises and apartments. Where are you going to plug in your electric car? And again, this is a consequence of most of the people who are in this conversation will be people who live in homes and who live in rich countries. So, for most people in Cairo, it's not the first choice to, I want an electric car. It's more that I would actually like a scooter kind of thing. So we've no sense of the size of the proportion of the problems. And again, we need to recognize we're not going to solve all problems at once. We're certainly not doing that right now. So I keep advocating. That's actually my day job. I'm president of an organization called Copenhagen Consensus, where we work with more than 300 of the world's top economists and 7 Nobel laureates in economics to look at where can you do the most good. given that there are lots of problems, not all problems are equally easy to solve. Not all of them are equally cheap to solve. So we try to identify what are the very cheapest things where you can do the most good for every dollar spent. So, it's a very sensible thing to say, where can you actually spend a dollar and get the most bang for the buck? Not surprisingly, it's not climate change. You can do some good, and especially you should do this in investing in green energy R&D so that we can get these new technologies on board. But fundamentally, it's about curing people from tuberculosis and malaria, and getting better food and getting better education, and get some of their opportunities for better food in the and long-term future through more research and development into yield rises. Very simple, but kind of boring things. We don't talk about them. They don't make for great headlines. They just happen to be incredibly effective. And so we really need to stop having this mindset of, I want to go with the next media message, the water bottle thing, and actually ask, what are the smarter things? And we know a lot of smart things. Let's do those, and let's do those first.
You took the words right out of my mouth, because I was going to say, what can we do? And that's really important. I mean, education, increasing yields, making sure that the food supply.
He has a lot of geoengineering, cell-grown meat. These are things that you mentioned in your book that there is a lot of innovation in, but you mentioned that the actual domestic spending on research and development for these things has, gone down by half since the 1980s. So, we can't just put up solar panels and take pictures in front of them and give each other a thumbs up. We have to think about things that actually will move the needle, that are more sustainable. And you point out that there's precedents for this from human beings that stopped using whale fat for oil because we were just running out of whales. We had to think of something, right? And so we can, and we have done this before.
Yeah. I mean, a great other example is Los Angeles in the 1950s. It was a very polluted place, mostly because of cars. And the sort of standard environmental approach would be to tell everyone, I'm sorry, could you all walk or run instead? And of course, that would never work in Los Angeles.
Right.
The real trick was the innovation of the catalytic converter. You got this little gizmo in 1974. Yeah, it cost a couple $100. You put it on your exhaust pipe, and essentially it cleans most of the exhaust. There's still lots of problems in Los Angeles, but fundamentally,
well, now they're stealing them. Now, because of their other policies, people are stealing catalytic converters. Like, isn't that a strange? I mean, I just think irony. About that. Irony here.
That's a fun change.
Yeah.
But let me just pull that back though, and the basic idea was, you don't solve this by telling everyone, I'm sorry, could you do without? Could you be less well off? Could you be a little more miserable that you just have to walk? You solve problems by getting innovations that make it possible for people to do more with the same stuff. Likewise, we worried in the 1970s about a lot of things, but also about the world running out of food. A lot of nations like India and Africa not being able to feed themselves. The solution was not for, to say to everyone, I'm sorry, could you eat a little less and then we'll send it down to Africa? The solution was the Green Revolution. We basically made these grains that would yield twice or three times as much food for every hectare or acre. That's how you solve a problem. Now, India is the world's leading rice exporter. There's still lots of problems. I'm not saying we've solved all issues here, but the fundamental point is, you don't solve stuff by saying to people, you can't have a water bottle, you can't do this, you must do this, you shouldn't do. You solve it by technology. Again, look at nuclear power. Nuclear power is very safe, and it delivers baseload power, so 24/7. But the problem is currently new nuclear, third generation nuclear power cost a fortune. So we've seen that both in France and the UK and in Finland, many other places. So fundamentally, it's really hard to do this well. But people like Bill Gates and many others are arguing fourth generation nuclear could actually be the thing. It'll be little modularized, much safer, and incredibly cheap power. Now, this may not work out because they also told us that the other three generations would be incredibly cheap. But if the research works out, that could basically be these little sort of mini generators that would power a little neighborhood. and that would do so incredibly cheaply, and we could basically run everything on electric power, and it would be totally clean. How cool would that be?
Right.
This is one possibility. Again, there are lots of these ideas, and I'm not advocating fourth generation nuclear. I don't have any stock in that. I don't know whether that's the one that's going to work out. It could also be solar with massive amounts of batteries, but we need to develop battery technology much, much better. It could also be, many, many other ideas that are out there. Craig Venter, the guy who cracked the human genome back in 2000, he has this idea of growing algae on the ocean surface, genetically modified algae. These algae would soak up sunlight and CO2 and produce oil. And then we'd just simply harvest. We'd have all our Saudi Arabias out on the ocean surface. We'd harvest that, get all the oil. We'd run our entire fossil fuel economy, but it would be CO2 neutral because the oil that we just harvested just soaked up that CO2 that we're now going to put out when we burn the
I like that.
oil.
Let's do that.
I like that idea.
Yeah.
It reminds me of Back to the Future,
The point is, I don't know whether that's going to work out, but we should be focusing on all those solutions because we're not going to solve this by telling everyone you can't develop. We're not really going to do that with the US and Europe, but we're certainly not going to be able to do this with India, China, and Africa.
Right.
But if we came with, say, fourth generation nuclear, this other innovation, and said, hey, this is actually cheaper than fossil fuel, it's better, and it solves global warming, would you like it? They're going to say yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have an idea for your follow-up book because you talk about toxicity panic at the last part of your book. And this is also something that I have had since I had my first child. And you point out that legislation that limits toxins is actually not very effective and costly and has a sort of opportunity costs of saving lives in other ways. But toxins is something that also the media tells me I must be afraid of. It's funny because I'm afraid of all of these climate and toxin things that the media tells me to be. But I was a researcher on the book, The Culture of Fear, so I should know better, right? I have a social science degree, but I've bought into this. So maybe your next book can tell me how to not be afraid of toxins, because that is also something that, we all pick up and think about.
I've actually written another book that does a little bit of that, The Skeptical Environmentalist.
Okay, I'm ready for it.
We have this idea that pesticides are incredibly dangerous. That's one of the reasons why people want to go organic. And look, I'm not saying you should go out and eat pesticides. Fundamentally, that's a really bad idea.
Okay.
But what we have seen over the last 30 years is that pesticides become much less dangerous because we've actually developed new that are much, much less dangerous. And of course, they give you access to cheap and plentiful and often very useful, especially fruits and vegetables that keep your health better. So the funny thing is when people say, oh, you should go organic instead of eating conventional food, or you could also call it science-based food, it's true that you will get less pesticide residue, which is trivial in any well-regulated society. But it also means you can afford to buy less fruits and vegetables. Now, fruits and vegetables is one of the best ways to avoid cancer. So it turns out that you very easily end up getting much more cancer because you buy stuff that is much more expensive, especially for your kids. Likewise, we have no sense of, why is there pesticides and, for instance, organics use a lot of pyrethrin. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but from a well-known flour, because flowers and everything else develops toxins. Remember, if you're an animal, you can sort of move if you're threatened by someone else. But if you're a plant, you're just stuck there. If the cow comes over, what are you going to do? Except develop toxins. So almost all plants develop lots of toxins, especially if they're attacked. So most pesticides are not synthetic pesticides, they're natural pesticides. For instance, coffee is probably our main intake. Oh, now you're reaching for your coffee.
Yeah.
You'd have to pry it out of my cold, dead hand.
Yes. Is our main intake of natural pesticides. So is tea. I've just been drinking tea. So it's not, I'm simply pointing out that we need a much better sense of what's the proportion of our risks here. And by far the biggest proportion is that you don't eat right, much more than the pesticide residues. And of course, again, much, much more important is that you don't smoke, that you're not overweight, that you exercise, these kinds of very, very simple things. that we all know about. And that's a little boring again. And we're back to the whole point of saying we need a sense of proportion.
Yeah,
it's not boring. It's life-changing for me. It's also taken a lot of, like I said, my superiority complex away, because I can't, I think it's really useful for me.
So thank you for that. Thank you for that.
I owe a lot of people apologies. I'm sorry, especially to my mother-in-law, who I like to lecture about, like, what I'm doing for my babies, right? Like,
and I'm not, these plastic straws and all this stuff. Yeah. So we're going to send this video to make sure my mother-in-law watches it.
I'm sorry, Verna.
Our guest has been Bjorn Lomborg. He's the author of the book False Alarm: How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet. Bjorn, where can people find more of your work?
So you can follow me on Twitter or on Facebook. We also have website, both my personal website, lomborg.com, and my organization, which is copenhagenconsensus.com. But I think, Twitter is probably the right place to, get those bite-sized informations. And then obviously I try to write a lot of columns, and I think it is a good book. I've written a lot of books. This latest book, The False Alarm, I had a very good editor on Basic Books in New York. Basically because she kept saying, that's pretty good, but you can write it better. So we did a lot of rewrites. I think this is a very, very streamlined book. So I'm glad you liked it.
It's actually,
one of those.
If you read this current, let's see, what is the thing that the scientists, the declaration, the World Climate Declaration, that is just a bunch of bullet points. So your book is basically the required reading to back it up, is how I feel about it. So everyone
it's the director's
should read
track.
this.
It's what you should read to understand why these scientists are upset. So excellent book. We've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's changed lives. Hopefully it'll change a lot more lives.
It's made me
as well.
like 5,000% less obnoxious. So that is helpful.
That's a win. That is an absolute
That's a
win.
weird statistic, actually.
That should be on the book jacket. It's made my wife 5,000% less. Yeah, that's what we're going to put on that.
I still have a long way to go. I can be pretty obnoxious.
Bjorn, thank you so much for joining us here on Redacted. Keep up the great work.